Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today we're going to continue on that large bookcase build. This is the second video in a series that I'm doing on a large built-in bookcase. Now it's about 8 feet wide and almost 9 feet tall. And part of the catch is it has to be small enough that I can move all the pieces and install it by myself. If you haven't seen the first video, I'll add a link to that below and you can check it out. In this video, we're going to focus on completing the base cabinets and building and installing the doors. Let's see how far we get with this one.
I started phase 2 with the miter saw. The stiles and rails were cut to rough length, or about an inch or two longer than necessary. This gives me a little wiggle room to work with. I took those blanks over to the table saw and ripped them down into strips just over 2 inches wide. Then it was over to the planer to clean up the saw marks and take the pieces to their final width of 2 inches. Back at the table saw, I put in my stacked dado set for a 1/4 inch wide and 3/8 inch deep cut. I set my fence to get the dado as close as possible to the center. I clamped a featherboard in place to ensure that my stock stayed tight to the fence during the cut. Every stile and rail was run through, first with one face against the fence. Then the piece was flipped around and run through with the opposite face against the fence. This ensures that the groove will be centered in the stock. Here you can see how little stock is removed on that second pass.
So ignoring the one remaining bicycle in the shop, let's do the math to figure out the size of our doors, or at least the parts of them. Our opening is 29.5 inches wide, 22.5 inches tall. The stiles are the easy ones. You need 1/8 of an inch top and bottom, so that's 1/4 inch. 22.5 minus 1/4, 22 1/4 inch for the stiles. The rails are a little bit trickier because we're going to use double doors for each opening. We're going to start with the 29.5. From that, we're going to take out 2 inches for each of the stiles. 2, 4, 6, 8. That gives us 21.5. And there's also 1, 2, 3 spaces we need to leave for swing, each one about 1/8 of an inch. It's 21 1/8. Now we have to divide that by 2. We're going to check that math before we cut anything, but it should be around 10 5/8. But that's only this space. We also need to leave room for the tenons because we're going to connect these with mortise and tenons. So in each one, I'm going to come in 3/8 of an inch, so another 3/4, and that'll give us 11 1/8, based on this number being correct, but we'll check that before we cut. Okay, before anybody's head blows up, I did double check my math. 21 1/8 divided by 2 works out to 10 9/16. To that, we're going to add the 3/4 because it's 3/8 on either end, and that becomes 11 5/16. So that's going to be the length of our rails.
Based on my math, I cut 2 sample pieces to length and added the tenons on their ends. With the 2 sides snug against the face frame, I should have about 3/8 of an inch of a gap. But if we look closely, it's only about 3/16 of an inch. I need to adjust my stop and trim off a bit more. After recutting the rail test pieces, I have the gap closer to 5/16 of an inch, and that's good for now. I think once things are clamped together and sanded smooth, we'll be pretty close to that 3/8 inch gap that I was shooting for. With the stop set on my miter saw from those test cuts, I can now go back and square one end of each rail and then cut them to length against that stop. With the rails cut to length, I can now cut the tenons on their ends. Because I centered the groove on the stile, the tenons will be centered on the rails. I used the same 1/4 inch dado setup as before and adjusted the blade height until I got a snug fit. I used my miter gauge to keep the stock square to the blade and used my fence to determine the width of the tenon. And don't worry about using the miter gauge and fence at the same time. In this instance, there's no waste stock that can get trapped between the two and get kicked back. 2 or 3 passes on either face is all it takes to clean up that tenon for a snug fit. By now you should realize that I don't like to rely on my math skills, so I dry assemble the door frame to get to the size of the panel I'll need. After checking the diagonals to ensure that the frame is square, I mark the groove of the stile where the inside of the rail meets. These marks determine the length of the panel. I transfer these marks to the edge of the stiles and use my tape to determine the length of the panel. Rather than trying to line up the end of my tape, I start my measurement from the 10-inch point and go from there. In this case, my panel needs to be 19 inches long, but I'll probably cut it about a 1/16 inch short of that. The width of the panel is based on the size of the rails, or 11 1/4 inches. Again, I'll cut them about a 1/16 of an inch short, although I'm using plywood panels and there's almost no chance of wood movement. With those measurements in mind, I can take some 1/2 inch birch plywood to the table saw and rip it to width. Then it's back to the miter saw where one end of each panel is cut square and then cut to its final length. This may seem like an extra step, but I'm tired of dealing with plywood tear-outs. I set my table saw blade so its height was just below the depth of the rabbet I'd soon make, and the far side of the blade would cut the shoulder of that rabbet. With the sketchy plywood currently on the market, this is the best way I could think of to maintain a clean edge. I ran each panel on each edge to define those shoulders. Now I could set up my router table with a 1/2 inch straight bit. Once I get the bit height and fence location dialed in, I could remove the stock on the outside of those shoulder cuts. I just took things slow and stopped a few times to remove some random chunks of ply that got stuck in the fence, and a few bits of mystery cloth-looking stuff that was buried between the layers. With the rabbets done, the panel got a quick sanding with some 150 grit paper on my random orbit sander. I also sanded the rabbet by hand with some 220 paper and a sanding block, and I eased the edges while I was at it. Before assembly, I primed both faces of the panel. It's easier to get into that rabbet now, and this will make sanding the inset front face easier if the primer raises the grain. I also took the time to sand the inside edge of the stiles and rails. This would be hard to get to after assembly. I'm not overly concerned about rolling the ends of my stiles with the sander, because if I do, it would be on that excess stock on the ends. Still, I work carefully to keep things square. Once that was done, I could transfer the layout lines onto the face of each stile. These lines represent the outside edge of the doors, and I make sure to always mark from the original stile each time. The clamp just helps hold things in place while I work. The next day, I could assemble the doors. I started with a bit of glue on one end of the rails, set them in place close to my layout line. Then I slid in a panel, making sure it sat cleanly into the rails and stile, another bead of glue on the end of the rails, and the second stile was tapped in place, again keeping the rails close to my layout lines. A few taps of the mallet, and when everything looked right, the clamps were tightened. The excess glue was wiped away, then the door was checked for square and set aside to dry. Then I repeated this 5 more times. I let the doors sit overnight, pulled them out of the clamps, and it was time to cut off those horns. I put a crosscut blade on my table saw and got out my small sled. Then I could register the edge of the rail against the side of the sled and make each cut. A couple of times I did have to make a second pass to get it nice and clean, at least on one end of each door. Then I set my fence to the height of my doors and made one last pass so that all the doors were the same height, and cleaning up any last bits of those excess stiles. With that done, all the doors were sanded to clean up all the glue joints and any saw marks. I'm using European hinges on these doors, so I chucked up a 35mm Forstner bit in my drill press. The fence was set 20.5mm away from that center point, and this is why I keep one metric tape in the shop. I set the stop 2 7/8 inches away from the door edge. This will put the hinges 3 inches up or down from the face frame. I also set my depth stop so I wouldn't go too deep through the doors, yet still be deep enough to accommodate the hinge. After drilling one hinge cup in each door, the stop was moved to the opposite side. Again, set it 2 7/8 inches down, and the second hole was drilled in each door. I sanded the drilled stiles with my palm sander, but almost forgot the edges. I like the look of a square edge, but these were still sharp. Not only would that be uncomfortable to the touch, but finish doesn't adhere well to sharp edges. That and a sharp edge damages much easier than one that's been eased a bit. A little 220 paper by hand was all it took. The doors were blown off and then wiped down with a microfiber cloth and given a coat of primer on both sides. I made sure to angle the spray gun into the space between the panel and the stile and rails to make sure I got good coverage. The primer dried overnight, and I sanded the doors again to remove any raised grain from that water-based primer. Then they got 2 more coats of paint on both sides and given some time to properly dry. During the door building process, I used the downtime to complete the boxes. First up was removing the blue tape I had put on the front edges of the cabinets. This prevented the biscuit slots from getting paint in them. Next came drilling the shelf holes. After way too many years, I finally broke down and bought a Kreg shelf pin jig. I don't see a need for a shelf to be lower than 6 inches, so I marked my start hole in the jig to make things easier on myself. You just drill the appropriate holes, slide the jig up, drop the alignment pin in the last hole, and keep going. Once I got to about 7 inches from the top, I marked that hole, again to use it as a reminder as where to stop. My thought was that drilling these after finishing would prevent them from filling with paint. In reality, the less than stellar plywood had a tendency to tear out, despite my best efforts. Next time I'll drill first and then paint. Touching these up was a pain in the butt. With the shelf pin holes drilled and repaired, it was time to add the backs. I dropped a back onto each cabinet, put a 1/4 inch crown staple in 3 corners, and checked for square before adding that last corner. Then a few more around the sides and bottom to hold it in place. I didn't fasten it to the top rail, mostly because the only staple I could find in the shop were too long and would have blown through. Since the cabinets will be fastened to the wall through the top rail and the back, I'm pretty sure they won't be going anywhere. I want to assemble the cases to fit the doors. I started by lining them up by eye and throwing on a few quick grip clamps. Then I used an awl to make sure that the holes for the panel connectors lined up. This also helps to knock out any chips that may be in there. Then the long side of the connector is pushed or tapped through each set of holes. Then the smaller portion is threaded in from the opposite side. I snugged them up with a pair of Phillips head screwdrivers, and the 3 cabinets are now one unit. It seems that I forgot to hit record as I set the face frame in place. I used the dowel and biscuits to guide it in position and added a few pocket hole screws. Not all the ones I drilled in the previous video, just enough to hold it in place. The inset hinges I found were for frameless cabinets. To adapt them for my cabinet, I made a filler piece for each hinge. Now, if you've done the layout just so and your measurements are spot on, all your filler pieces will be the same size. If you're like me, then you'll need multiple thicknesses of fillers to appropriately fill those gaps. I started with a spacer to locate the bottom hinge filler, added a bit of CA glue, and then tacked them in place with some 23 gauge pins. Then I used a second spacer to locate the top hinge filler, and that was glued and pinned in place. I did this for all 6 sets of hinges. I know these are inside and will most likely never be seen, but I still used an artist brush and some paint to help hide those pins on those fillers. It only took a few minutes and really helps to hide the pins. Once the paint had time to dry, I could add the hinge plates to the cabinets. I created a dummy door with the hinge located in the same spot as the real doors. I set that in place on top of an 1/8 inch spacer, made sure my door was flush with the outside of the cabinet, and then pre-drilled the hinge plate for the first screw. I used a self-centering Vicks bit to ensure the location was correct. Then I drove in that first screw. I repeated this on the lower hinge, then opened the false door and drilled for the lower screws on each hinge. These plates have a third screw location, and that's accessed by removing the door. Once all the fasteners were set, I removed them one at a time and replaced them with a longer screw that penetrated the hinge plate, the filler stock, and into the cabinet wall, locking everything together. Shifting over to the doors, we can add the other half of the hinges. Set each hinge in a cup hole, check that they were square to the door, pre-drilled with that same Vicks bit, and then drove in the screws. Then just repeated that a whole bunch of times. With all the hinges attached, I can take the doors to the cabinets and snap the hinges to the mounting plates. One or two of the connections were off just a bit, but you can loosen the adjustment screw and slide one of the plates up or down until everything lines up just right. Now I had an idea that this might happen. The hinges are actually pulling the doors too far in, but that's okay because I have a plan. I made a stop for each door about 1.5 inches wide, 3/4 of an inch thick, and 1 3/4 of an inch long, or just long enough to hang down about 3/8 inches below the face frame. They were painted and pre-drilled. Then I determined the center point of the face frame so I could mount them. I used an 1/8 inch spacer to set them away from the upper cabinet rail. This will prevent them from catching during the final installation. Clamped the block in place and drove in 2 1.25 inch screws to hold the stops in place. Now the doors close almost correctly, and I'll do that final tweaking once the cabinets are installed. At least now they're fully closed, but don't go past the face frames.
The main focus on this video was building and installing the doors. And while some people might think 1/2 inch panels are a bit overkill, I think a 1/4 inch panel seems to be a bit thin and flimsy. I also have an older video where I show how I make raised panel doors, and I'll link that below. I did leave out the shelves in this video because all the shelves in the entire unit are going to be the same, so we'll do those later. And speaking of later, the follow-on video will build the upper part of the cabinets, and if everything goes to plan, there could be an additional video where I take you along on the installation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. Was there something I could have done differently, safer, smarter? Drop in the comments below. I'd love to hear. As usual, in the description below, I've got some links to the tools and materials that I've used in the build of this process, and some of them have affiliate links, and if you need something and you buy it through those links, it does help our channel keep going. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. And if you haven't already, maybe it's time to hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. I think I know what's coming up next, but you never know. So until then, have a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.